So in 1977, the US Department of Agriculture produced their food pyramid, which became the basis for dietary guidelines in all English-speaking countries. In some countries, fortunately, they didn't speak English, so they didn't adopt it, and you'll see that they were much healthier in the next period of time. So what they did was they said the foods that we'd eaten for 2 to 3 million years, the meat, the poultry, the fish, etc., was suddenly couldn't eat it anymore, and you had to eat the foods which I showed you yesterday had only been in the food chain for 12,000 years and to which we could not have adapted in that short time. And it's much worse than that, because as we will argue, carbohydrates, which became the main source of the new diet, are completely non-essential to human existence. You do not need to eat 1 gram of carbohydrate, and I will argue that in due course. And so essentially what we did was we replaced healthy foods, which were at the second tier, the third tier, we replaced them with this, with glucose, for which the human body has only a requirement because from what it can produce itself. You do not have to take any glucose external to the body to survive. And I will show you our own data to show that that is the case. You have a liver that generates glucose, and it can generate all the glucose you need and all requirements for health. So we took out what we'd lived on for millions of years and we replaced it with a nutrient for which we have no essential requirement, and to which we had not been exposed in a great extent in many communities for long periods of time, i.e. for millions of years. And the next page, this is what happens. So we take the American advice, and they're the most obese nation in the world. Now, it doesn't make sense. Does South Africa go and ask Bangladesh to teach us how to play rugby? No, we go to New Zealand. But yet, but when we ask for dietary guidelines, we go to the United States, which is the most obese nation in the world. It doesn't make sense. So let's look then on the next page. And these are the dietary guidelines which were produced by the expert witness for the complainant. And these guidelines, I'm obviously going to summarize them briefly. Make starchy foods the basis of most meals, and that fits with the US dietary guidelines. Eat plenty of vegetables and fruits every day. And I've got no complaint with the problem of vegetables, but fruits are a problem because they're high in carbohydrate and sometimes fructose, but they aren't high in nutrients, as I would show you. Eat fat sparingly, so the advice again is to reduce carb. And what I'm going to show you, in any insulin-resistant population, this is the perfect prescription for obesity and type 2 diabetes. And that is my whole complaint, that because it doesn't consider the nature of the individual for whom the advice is presented, it's going to cause problems. And I will spend a great deal of time talking about insulin resistance and how prevalent the condition is. So what happened in the United States was that after 1976, you can see that the prevalence of obesity starts to rise. So if we go from left to right on this slide, you will see that after 1976, obesity rates suddenly start to rise. And so from 31 million obese people in 1971, we go to 111 million people in 2010. And of course, people will argue its association, and people are very keen to say that obesity is a complex disease. And I don't believe that's the case, and I believe that industry is very happy to tell us that, because then we don't have to address the real causes of obesity. And I think we'll talk at length about some of these ideas, but you see, one has to understand, if industry is causing the problem, they're going to make sure that we don't find a solution. And so we get this idea, well, obesity is a complex problem and we can't address it. And I'm going to try to explain to you it's not. Obesity is a relatively simple biological explanation. What to do about it is a little more complex, but we mustn't confuse the two. Biologically, obesity is a simple disease. To try and reverse it is complex, but we mustn't confuse the two. And that's what we're not doing. We're saying it's too complex to understand. The biology, the physiology of obesity is too complex. So then it's easy to say, oh, well, you see, the obesity occurred not for biological reasons, but it's because people were doing less exercise and all sorts of other things. But in fact, I'll show you it's not. It's much more simple than that. Well, this slide just repeats what I said, that we went from 15% obesity rates in the United States from 1971 to 1975 to 36%. So a third of all Americans now are rated obese, and that's the number in terms of numbers. And this again just shows the same pattern, that obesity rates were relatively low up to 1976, and then they start to increase both in men on the left and women on the right. And it's important to realize that we had low obesity rates when people were eating the diet that we considered to be dangerous. They had low obesity rates. And then we changed the healthy diet and obesity rate starts to rise. And this is the elephant in the room that no one will address. We make the dietary guidelines, this problem occurs, and we say, well, it can't be what we said. It can't be the dietary guidelines that are causing it. And no one will address it. It's like, okay, that's not our problem. It can't be nutritional. It has to be something else. And if there were any specific reasons why obesity had occurred, it might just occur in one population or one age group. And then we might start to think, well, that specific age group or that population group are particularly at risk or something, or there's something changed there. But in the United States, it occurred to all ages. And this shows that it doesn't matter whether you're 45 to 64, 30 to 40, 65 or older, or 18 to 29, the obesity rates just start to rise. And they all happen at the same time. So something changed in the environment there. And please understand, can't be genetic because the genes have been stable. Something happened in the environment in 1977 that caused this obesity to occur. And this is a lovely quote from Winston Churchill: no matter how beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. And that's the point. People need to address the results. We change the guidelines. It's a responsibility of the people who change the guidelines to say, absolutely, it had nothing to do with the current obesity diabetes rate. And this is the reason why. And we've researched it and we've shown this is why. But they're reluctant to do that. This is a complex slide. It shows the body mass index, which is your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And generally we like people to have a BMI below 25. And once it's above 30, it's more of a problem, and we call that obese. And the blue lines, or the blue colors, show what the distribution was. So there were quite a lot of thin people right towards the left with BMI of, let's say, 15 or 18. And then they've all shifted to the right. And so now there are very few people who are that lean. And the curve has moved to the right, and it's got this long tail now of really some morbidly obese people, 70%, BMIs of 70. And so what you can see is that this is the pattern, that it's crossed across the population. Everyone has got slightly fatter, and some people have got extremely much more fat over the time. Now, to prove that a particular nutrient in the diet could have been responsible, we need to look at what was the change in the diet of Americans during this period. And that appears on the next page. So this slide is from the NHANES data, which is a 4-yearly analysis of what Americans are eating and their obesity rates, etc. And this blue dot indicates that men in 1971 were eating 2,500 calories, of which just over 1,000 calories came from carbohydrates, just under 1,000 calories came from fat, and about 400 calories came from saturated fat. And women, the numbers are smaller because women are obviously smaller, so they're going to eat less, about 1,500 calories. Now, what I'm going to take you through is what happened after 1971 to 1980, and there you can see that nothing changed. The energy consumption is the same for both men and women. The amount of carbohydrates eaten is the same. The amount of fat eaten is the same. The amount of saturated fats not changed, which you wouldn't expect it to, because Americans weren't told to change their diet only later in this period. But Americans are clever, and when they're told to do things, they do it. And they religiously changed their diets. And they'd been told to eat more carbohydrates, so they did. And here you can see now, instead of just over 1,000 calories from carbohydrates, it goes up to, let's say, 1,300 calories from carbohydrates for men, and it does the same, also increases for women. So American people started to do exactly what they were told to do, and they retained that change right through to 2000, and I'll show you a change continued right through to modern days. But this is the law of unintended consequences. If you don't carefully think it through and understand the biology, you're going to make a big error. And the big error they made was entirely predictable, because what happened was, notice the blue line. The blue line is energy intake, and the energy intake goes up after 1980 in both men and women. And that was an entirely predictable response because carbohydrates drive hunger. And that's a crucial point to know. So that we call carbohydrate-induced hyperphagia. If you tell people to eat more carbohydrates, they will eat more calories. And I don't think I need to tell anyone here that if you eat more calories, you're going to get fat. So here now we have evidence that we have a dietary change which induces the change that was wanted, but it produces an unintended consequence. And that unintended consequence is increased calorie consumption, and that then has to drive the obesity rates. Now remember John Yudkin. I introduced him yesterday as the man who was demonized because he said sugar was dangerous, and his whole career ended. And he was one of the leading nutrition scientists in the world in the 1960s, early 70s. Well, in 1970, he published a work with Anne Stock. And this was a small study, but it's published in a reputable journal. And what he did was he took a group of 11 people, 11 subjects, and he said, I want you to eat your normal diet, and then we'll analyze it, and then we're going to put you on a low carbohydrate diet. After that, but the key was, he said, I want you to eat to hunger. You can eat as much as you like on both diets. And what happened? Let's look at the calories. On the normal diet, these men and women ate 2,300 calories. On the low carbohydrate diet, they ate 1,500 calories. A reduction of 700 calories, which is highly significant. So you'd say, but how can you eat less calories and not be hungry? Because we know calories drive hunger, and if you're eating too few calories, you're going to be more hungry. But it wasn't. These people were eating all the calories they needed to sustain their hunger. Their protein intake was the same, and their fat intake actually went down on the low carbohydrate diet, and that's also quite interesting. So although this is a high fat diet, because it has most of the energy will be coming from fat, in fact the total amount of fat goes down. And that's a very important point. So when we talk about a high fat diet, it may not in absolute terms be an increase in fat intake, it may be a reduction in fat intake because your calories have come down. And so a person who loses 40 kilograms on this diet, their fat intake will have gone way down because their calorie consumption's gone down. And it's a point we need to make. But what's gone down is the carbohydrate intake has gone down. So if you were to look at these data, you would have to say the reason why these people were eating less calories and being satiated because they were eating less carbohydrate. And that would then confirm the issue that hunger is driven by carbohydrates.